Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayyer. I'm head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this morning, assessing America's response to the Gaza crisis, the White House, Congress, and the American public. The war on Gaza is having devastating consequences for Palestinians, Israel, the region, and the world. Perhaps more than any other crisis in recent years, this moment has reverberations across the globe. How has the United States responded to this moment? How can we assess the responses from the White House, from Congress, and from the US public? What do these different responses tell us about the United States and its ability to pursue its stated objectives of peace and security and stability in the region and beyond? What are the consequences of this important moment for American foreign policy? We hope to shed light on some of these questions in our discussion today. I encourage all of our attendees today to also check out the various publications and events that we've produced that analyze the ongoing war and the broader crisis from different perspectives. These can all be found on our website, and we'll be sure to add more in the days and weeks ahead. I'm glad that we can bring you today's conversation with experts who will cover different pieces of this. We'll begin with 10 to 12 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists, followed by moderators' questions, and then questions from our audience. Please note that you don't need to wait until the Q&A portion to submit your questions to this morning's speakers. You can send them in at any time using our Q&A feature here in Zoom, or you can send them in via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. I've asked each of our panelists today to begin with their introductory remarks and sort of tackling different pieces of this question, the White House, Congress, and U.S. public opinion, but we'll get their perspectives on all different pieces of this during the question period as well. In the interest of time, I want to move directly to introducing our guests now in the order they'll be presenting, and then we'll move to introductory remarks to start our discussion. So we're glad to have joining us today Aaron David Miller, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Laura Friedman, who's the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and Shibli Telhami, who's professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland, as well as the director of the Critical Issues Poll there as well. Welcome. All of you, thank you so much for being with us today. Very much looking forward to this conversation. Aaron, the mic is yours to get us started with introductory comments.
First of all, it's terrific to be here, Youssef, with you and Lara and Shibli. It's an important conversation to have. I'm going to have to go at 11. I'm going to try to be brief in my introductory comments. Let me make 6 basic observations. I'm reporting here on how I understand Biden administration policy. I'm not a member of the Biden administration. I have friends who occupy senior positions in that administration who I respect and admire. This is a complicated issue for any administration, Republican and or Democrat. And so six basic observations. Number one, first, setting the frame. It was clear to me from the president's October 10th speech, which was one of the most emotional of his presidency, that he sent an unmistakable signal that he was going to give the Israelis time, space, and support to do what they believed they needed to do against Hamas in the wake of the October 7th attacks. This should have come as no surprise to anyone for 3 reasons. First, the president's persona. Alone among modern American presidents, Joe Biden really believes that he is part of the Israeli story. His wartime visit to Israel, I think, demonstrated that fact. The presidential model here is not Barack Obama, it's Bill Clinton, though Biden and Clinton are a generation apart. In the cases of both presidents, they have this extraordinary regard. I would even use the word love. Clinton writes in his memoirs that he had loved Rabin as he had rarely loved any man, which is an extraordinary statement for a U.S. president to make. But even in Biden's case, decades of experience in dealing with Israelis of all political persuasions has left a high regard and love for the idea of Israel deeply imprinted on his emotional and his political DNA. So its persona drove him, it's particularly in the wake of the savagery and brutality of October 7th. Second is politics. In the beginning, it seemed, and the divisions within the Democratic Party and the American public will be triggered later, that in Biden's view, his support for Israel in the wake of October 7th was good politics as well, particularly in a divided political environment in which the Republican Party has emerged as the sort of Israel can do no wrong party. Democrats are divided, obviously, between mainstream Democrats increasingly willing to speak out on aspects of Israeli policy that they don't like, and progressives who not only speak out, but want to impose costs and consequences for policies they don't like. But Biden, I think, was sensitive to the reality of the fact as he enters 2024, he did not want to give the Republican Party any additional ammunition to accuse him of being weak on Israel. The third issue, in addition to persona and politics that drove the administration, was in the beginning concern over micromanaging Israeli tactics and war aims on three key issues. Number one, how do you conduct a campaign to eradicate a military terrorist organization without killing large numbers of innocent civilians? Number two, how do you surge humanitarian assistance into a war zone? And number three, what is the ultimate objective with respect to the Israeli operation, with respect to the future of Gaza? On all three of these questions, at least in the beginning, the administration had no compelling answers, no real alternatives that they were prepared to offer the Israelis. So the frame was set. Second, the other aspect of the administration's policy that was quite clear is deterrence. They immediately grasped that as bloody and as horrible as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was to become in the South, only in the North could events spiral out of control and perhaps trigger a regional confrontation, which the administration, as part of their efforts to maintain some sort of stability in the run-up to 2024, the election, compelled them to deploy two carrier strike groups to Eastern Med with approximately 200 strike aircraft, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and to message both directly and indirectly to both Hezbollah and Iran not to enter the fray. And I think until now, that message of deterrence seems to have worked. Both Hezbollah and Iran have made a calculation, at least up until now, and we're 55 days into this confrontation, that they did not seek a major confrontation with either the United States or with Israel. And I think Hezbollah and Israel have more or less, even though both have on certain days expanded the traditional rules of the game that they had established since the 2006 summer war, have maintained this sort of tense equilibrium. Third, U.S. policy has clearly evolved in response to the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, the humanitarian catastrophe that the Israeli military operations are causing, the displacement of 2/3 of Gaza's population, and an increasing loss of credibility at home and abroad. It has raised doubts in the administration about Israel's war tactics and its aims. The Israelis have not wanted to engage on the day after issue, largely, I suspect, for political reasons, given the Netanyahu's coalition partners. But the administration has moved in the past several weeks to what I would call pressing the Israelis, raising key questions without being willing to impose any costs or consequences if they didn't get the right answers. They sent a 3-star James Glynn, who had experience in Mosul, to advise the Israelis about how you conduct a counterinsurgency when civilians are involved. But Until very recently, the administration was reluctant, and fell far short of warning the Israelis that if in fact there was not greater sensibility and sensitivity to the three core questions that I identified earlier, that there would be consequences. And the administration has stayed far away, at least until now, of making public judgments on whether Israel was adhering to international humanitarian law. Fourth, clearly, the administration is in a bind. They've tethered themselves to Israeli war aims, which seem to revolve around the eradication of Hamas. And they are now looking for ways to de-escalate, perhaps even look for some sort of exit ramp. The hostage for prisoner exchange channel has created, and it started on November 24th, has created an opening in order to begin to try to find some way to de-escalate. How long this will go on is unclear. It is in the interests, for any number of reasons we get to discuss later, of Israel and Hamas to continue this channel. There are all sorts of reports, credible or not, of a broader deal being envisioned, which would be designed to deal with 160 hostages that Hamas still holds. Whether that will prove realistic or feasible is unclear, but there's no question that it's under consideration. Fifth, the next phase of this operation focuses not on exchanges of prisoners for hostages, but on the resumption of the Israeli ground campaign. I believe, and I have no way of validating this, that the administration's view has shifted from private and public advice to warnings on three core issues. Number one, you can't replicate in the South what you've done in the North. Number two, you must have a detailed plan to demonstrate that you will not attack military targets that are deeply embedded in civilian areas. And three, you have to create the time and the space to allow humanitarian aid not just to trickle and dribble into Gaza, but to surge into Gaza. Is this performative? Will the Israelis comply? Will there be consequences if they don't? I can't answer any of these questions. Finally, the future. The president made a dramatic assertion several weeks ago that he could not return to October. We would not go back to October 6th. Much stands in the way of that rather galactic commitment when you think about what that means. Number one, our two traumatized societies, which, in order to have the remotest chance of fulfilling the president's vision, will have to produce leaders that are prepared to take major decisions. Number two, Benjamin Netanyahu, in power longer than the administration would like. There's no mechanism right now to remove him. And in any event, military conflict has often produced situations where the next iteration of the Israeli political constellation is certainly, it doesn't drift to the center or even to the left. All you have to do is look at the impact of the 1973 war, which led in 1977 to the rise of Likud and literally an earthquake in Israeli politics, or even look to Sharon's triumph over Barak in 2001 in the wake of the Second Intifada, or look at Netanyahu after Ehud Olmert's disastrous management of the 2006 Israeli-Lebanese campaign. Two additional points. Number one, Israel, I would not even want to predict, and I don't think the Oracle at Delphi reading the best of Godin trails can predict what the future of Gaza is going to look like. One thing I think is fairly certain, that the Israelis will be in Gaza for a relatively prolonged period of time in some fashion. All of these elements will pose huge, huge challenges for the administration, bumping up against 2024, where good policy is likely to conflict, I'm afraid, with good politics.
Aaron, thank you very much for that breakdown. Appreciate it very much. And now we will turn to Laura for an assessment on Congress.
Thanks, Yusuf, and thanks, Aaron, for that masterful summary. Look, talking about how Congress has dealt with the current crisis, I think requires us to first recognize that for Congress, anything to do with Israel is going to be front and center as a political issue, and as we go into an election period, as an issue on which it is not merely a question of policy, but it is a question of either earning political capital or costing political capital to others. And that lens, I think, explains a lot of what we've seen from Congress over the past 6 weeks. At the beginning of this crisis, I think understandably, like with the Biden administration, we saw a frenzy of statements and legislation in support of Israel. I would argue that that makes sense both politically and also because it was a horrific attack on October 7th, and it is understandable and appropriate that people would want to be on the record with their outrage and their disgust and their support for people who suffered from those attacks. What we saw, though, and obviously the aftermath of those attacks taking place in Gaza became what that looked like became clear pretty much immediately. What we saw was a continuation of a bipartisan trend in Congress, which is, I would argue, led by Republicans who are constantly pushing to try to outdo one another on what it means to be pro-Israel. And in this context, pro-Israel unquestionably, and I mean unequivocally and almost entirely means anti-Palestinian. So you saw Republicans in a race to define what it meant to be pro-Israel in the current context. And you saw the Israeli caucus and the Israeli leadership, by and large, not only acquiescing to that, but joining in this contest, which is something, and we've seen this for the past 10 years or more, where it is the policy where there's very little bipartisanship available in Congress. There's a lot of bipartisanship in Congress when it comes to Israel, and it is bipartisanship led by the most extreme folks on the right, with everyone else on both parties, almost everyone else, rushing to catch up and say, no, we are standing exactly with you on this shoulder to shoulder. And then from the beginning, what we saw also was a small contingent. This is what people think of as the squad and squad adjacent, trying to inject some level of nuance, some level of reality and facts about what's happening to Palestinians into that debate, and largely being marginalized at best, and at worst, particularly if you are a Palestinian American member of Congress, being actively demonized, pilloried, and punished. In terms of legislation, and for folks who know me, I cover every Friday, I publish a roundup of everything Middle East related on Capitol Hill. And since October 7th, that has become a much simpler document because I can't cover everything. So I only cover legislation and letters and hearings. And just looking at legislation, what we have seen since October 7th is a deluge of bills, and these are people trying to pass binding laws and also non-binding resolutions, which is fundamentally grandstanding. Just nonstop. The numbers are like nothing I've ever seen before. The fundamental messages behind these bills, on the one hand, are we love Israel, we support Israel, we are prepared to support Israel in any possible way we can think of and put into law, including supporting Americans being evacuated from Israel, which is obviously a good thing. I don't believe, I can't remember any conflict in history where the US Congress has sought to pass laws to make sure that people evacuated because of a conflict don't have to pay back the US government. There's been numerous bills like that. We have, I mean, it's been fascinating to watch the creative efforts to come up with new things that something hasn't already come up with to show that you're the most pro-Israel person in Congress. These have been matched and in some ways outpaced by anti-Palestinian measures, and they are anti-Palestinian. They are framed in many cases as anti-terrorist or fighting anti-Semitism, but fundamentally being anti-terrorist on the Hill today, right now at least, means being anti-Palestinian, which also means being pro-Israel. And fighting anti-Semitism, which there's been a more than a decade-long effort to conflate with fighting criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism. At this point today, being pro-Israel means being anti-Palestinian, which means conflating everything to do with Palestinian protests and calls for Palestinian rights and Palestinian language as anti-Semitism. So that's been fun. We have also, there's been outright efforts. There's multiple pieces of legislation and letters out there calling for banning visas to Palestinians, calling for canceling all visas to Palestinians and deporting them. Hard to see that as anything but outright racism. On top of that, we have a really fun new thing in the past few weeks, which is using support for Israel as a hook to promote other agendas. So for instance, there's been letters and legislation, or I think it's just letters so far, using there's a new FDA regulation to ban the sale of menthol cigarettes in the US, and members of Congress who oppose this are basically saying you shouldn't do this because this will help Hamas and Hezbollah, who smuggle cigarettes to make money. Likewise, there are members of Congress who are against any reduction in the sales of weapons, who are taking on the US government, which has slowed the approval of some permits in weapons, and they're basically saying this is going to hurt Israel and you can't do it. So we have those little skirmishing going on. Fundamentally, the two big battles that I want to point out, and Yusuf, when I start talking too long, please nod at me. The first big battle is around aid. Obviously, as soon as this war started, the discussion in Congress was, how do we get money to Israel? We support Israel. Whatever Israel needs, we want, we'll pay for. The Biden administration got a very large aid request to Congress weeks ago. I think it's notable. They got it to Congress weeks ago. It's not moving. And it's not moving because there's some debate about what it should look like. And it's not because of the Israel money. And Republicans will say the problem is Democrats, because Biden wants to include emergency aid for Ukraine on that as well. And Democrats will say it's because Republicans don't want to fund Ukraine and are holding it hostage, holding funding to Israel hostage to Ukraine. That the Republicans want to add border security money because they have an agenda there. But most important, I would argue, for people watching the Hill, is that the new Republican leader who brought this legislation up in the House, it was the first piece of legislation he brought up when he took on leadership, he added to it an unprecedented condition on U.S. aid to Israel. This is emergency funding, so it's outside the normal budget process. And the new Republican leader in the House said, fine, we'll fund it, but it's got to be actually offset dollar for dollar by cuts to regular funding. That is a massive, to say $14.3 billion has to be offset by cuts to regular funding, which they want to take out of the IRS budget. I'm old enough to remember when there was a national news story daily, because Democrats in the House who were concerned about an extra, however many $1 billion it was for Iron Dome, I think it was $1 billion, was going without regular order, and they stopped it. So it was held up for like 36 hours in the House, extra money for Iron Dome. And that was framed as an incredible attack on Israel by Democrats. We've now had the aid package for Israel held up for weeks, arguably because Republicans have decided that it must be offset. Unprecedented aid condition. We'll come back to aid conditions in a second. The other main center of action, I would argue, is efforts in Congress to exploit the current conflict to once and for all bring the hammer down on criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism, particularly in universities. I think it's important to note this does not come from nowhere. Yusuf knows this, other people know it. This has been a battle that's been going on for years, with efforts at legislation in Congress and at the state level, with efforts to get the administration to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. What we are seeing right now is all of those previous efforts coming to a head at a moment when there is genuinely rising anti-Semitism in the world. No question about it. The focus of Congress, though, is not to deal with, once again, this is not new, is not to deal with actual rising anti-Semitism. It is to treat the protests that they are seeing in the streets. It is to treat the language coming out of members of Congress who care about Palestinian rights and Palestinian deaths, and to frame it all as anti-Semitic and anti-Israel and support for terror. And I've seen multiple pieces of legislation around that, including a resolution that was passed, I believe, yesterday or the day before in the House, which outright says that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which, of course, has been the argument of groups like the ADL for many years. The sort of looking forward, and here's where I'll end, looking forward trends. I mean, there's a couple of things to note here. I mean, members of Congress it's always going to be different than the White House because they are on a 2-year election cycle in the House, and the Senate is always in play. They're going to be more sensitive to the grassroots and to the political immediate implications of things than the White House. On the one hand, you have AIPAC making public its plans to spend, I think, $100 million to try to take out progressives. Whether they would have done this anyway, I don't know, but it's very clear they're connecting it to what's going on. And we've seen some really fascinating stories of candidates who've been offered millions of dollars to run against the candidates that AIPAC doesn't like. We'll see where that news goes. That doesn't seem to be, progressives are not backing off because of that pressure. In parallel, we're seeing unprecedented grassroots activism, and Shibley can talk about this when Shibley talks about the broader what's happening in the grassroots and the sort of public opinion. But I think it's really important to note members of Congress, and the House in particular, are acutely sensitive to what's happening at the grassroots. And this isn't about a giant national event at the mall. This is about people showing up at their offices, and it's having hundreds and hundreds of letters and calls coming in. And it's not a coincidence that as you see these shifts in what Shibley will be talking about in public opinion and in activism, you are seeing, in particularly, I would say in the past 2 weeks or so, a shift in the number of members of Congress who are finally belatedly talking about ceasefire, or who are talking about conditions on aid to Israel. There is, I think, a growing sense that this is where the grassroots is, and members of Congress, I expect, are going to continue to be more sensitive to that, even as I think the Democratic leadership, following the lead of the White House, is not particularly interested in changing course. And I would argue probably believes that changing course in terms of the political ramifications for them domestically, that it would be more costly for them to change course and outrage the forces of the Democratic right than they're worried about the impact on their election of a grassroots that believes they've betrayed their values.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. And just a couple notes before we move over to Shibley next. I did want to let viewers know that we are in the process of scheduling another event that we will be sharing with you soon, precisely about the intensifying repression against Palestine activism in this moment, some of which Laura mentioned in her comments. So look out for that. And also, please remember to submit your questions for the panelists through the Zoom Q&A feature or via email through events@arabcenterdc.org, so we can transition to those after introductory comments. Shibley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yusuf. I appreciate it. And I'm really pleased to share the podium with two friends, Aaron and Laura, whose views I certainly respect and learn from. And those were really excellent presentations. So I'm going to focus two of them were, one was about his persona, sort of what his affinity with
this. We lost you for a second. I think we lost you for a second. If you want to just start your thought over again.
So I'm going to focus most of my comments about public opinion and how public opinion might impact the political picture for the president moving forward. But before I do that, I wanted to just address a couple of elements or relate these public opinion to two elements that Aaron raised up front, which were really strong about sort of what drove the president to take the position he took, which is a full embrace of Israeli policy. The first, as Aaron said, was the persona, the president's persona, in terms of his own commitment to Israel and historical perspective. It's very, very personal to him. And the second was the political. And the two are connected in some ways. And I want to say why that is the case before I talk about sort of how the political is connected to public opinion. The persona part, I think Aaron is absolutely right about. I mean, we've many of us have known Joe Biden before he was president, interacted with him before, we've studied him before, we know what he stood for, no question about it. But I think it's politically connected in the sense that I think a lot of the people who are puzzled about his behavior is not so much about the fact that he might have a personal commitment, but that in this particular case, it's not just about do we support Israel or do we not support Israel. He is the president of the United States of America. His first objective is to defend the interest of the United States of America. And he was embarking on decisions that could, in fact, draw the United States into war. And he was making those decisions as if they were personal decisions. There's no evidence early on that he convened any interagency process to consider the options that were before him, to consider what the consequences would be for American interests. Even there is no evidence that he actually had that conversation before he sent 2 carrier groups into the region, which obviously both, yes, could be restraining, but could also be escalatory. It's both. And there was no evidence of that. There was evidence of him joining an Israeli war cabinet and meeting and not having something parallel in the US. So that's number one. Number two, even aside from the escalatory process that he could not control ultimately, we still don't know whether in the forthcoming, and I think there will be a forthcoming Israeli assault on southern Gaza, whether or not we will end up leading to an escalation that might draw Hezbollah or Iran in. That's still an open question. We already see the tension over the carriers and the Iranian drone that came close to one of the carriers. We don't yet know whether there will be, I hope not. Obviously, this would be devastating if that should happen, but it's still an open question as whether it's going to happen or not. And that was not obviously considered. But then you consider the fact that the president himself has said the obvious, which is Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course it does. And there was a lot of sympathy. The president's posture of embracing Israel right after the attack was universally supported in the US. There was no question about that. That was an important move for him to do that. It's a question of what Israel does in the name of self-defense. Every state has a right to self-defense, but no state alone can define what constitutes self-defense. There are international rules of the game, international laws. And in this particular case, there is no way the president could be certain that this government will only limit itself to, quote, self-defense, knowing that he had already said this is the most extreme Israeli government in its history, with objectives of many ministers that we know are not in harmony with U.S. interests or with U.S. values, including the prime minister of Israel himself. So the fact is that that is the big shocker. And in the meanwhile, it's not only U.S. credibility around the globe and U.S. credibility in the Middle East and beyond, but the fact is that the scale of what transpired is so intense over such an intense period of time that is likely to register on the consciousness of a whole new generation. So this is not just a mere something that is going to go away when the fighting stops. It is going to be impactful and lasting in much of the world, certainly in the Middle East, in a way that unfortunately could lead to blowback, and I hope not. But that's part of the kind of the puzzlement that has happened, particularly in the debates, and we talk about the impact on public opinion, particularly in the US, particularly among Democrats. It is this kind of like, Joe Biden, this is not a personal decision. This is a decision of the United States of America, and you cannot make it a personal decision. That's number one. Now, on the political side, I agree with Aaron on how the president may have calculated his interests about the politics. Part of it is he has a certain assumption about where the Democrats are. That is, in a way, a lingering, perception from his days as senators. I don't think he has fully internalized the big changes that have taken place in the Democratic Party that we've been documenting over the years, meaning that Democrats have overwhelmingly wanted the U.S. to be even-handed on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And in recent months and years, they have grown more and more sympathetic with the Palestinians, with more people in the polling over the past year sympathetic with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, and especially young Democrats, under 35 Democrats. That had been the case prior to the Hamas horrific attack on October 7th. There has been a change. But even if you assume, that his main concern is over where the Republican Party is, because he knows he doesn't want to be outdone by the Republican. But what does that mean to be outdone by the Republican Party? I mean, we don't say that about the gun control. We don't say I'm going to, they're going to be out there on gun control, so let me go and change my position on gun control in order to fend off the Republican criticism on gun control. That's just not the way we do business. He's not going to win the Republican Party. He's going to fight for his own Democratic constituency to be passionate, to turn out in large numbers, to stay with him, and also independents. And both of these clearly have not been with him on this issue. And let me just give you some of the examples. So there's our polling, but there's a lot of other polling that has been done since October 7th, the most recent of which is an important NBC poll. But there were a lot of them that have been done along the way. We have done two polls. One was only 2 weeks after the Hamas attack, when in fact the outcome, the focus was mostly on the horrific attack itself and the Israeli victims and what transpired there. And of course, the full official support of the United States of Israel, both in terms, not just in the White House and Congress, but really across community leaders. Even the NFL had, kind of a moment of silence for Israeli victims before it aired its games nationally. So you had all kinds of solidarity with the Israelis, which in fact did lead in our poll 2 weeks after into a spike in support for Israel of people who want the U.S. to lean toward Israel across the board, meaning among Republicans, among Democrats, among independents. Is an increase in the number of people who want to lean toward Israel did take place, except, by the way, among young Democrats. People who are under 35, Democrats under 35 were not affected by that period at all. They kept pretty much the same position they had back in June when we asked similar questions. By the way, our tracking questions were not impacted by wordings related to the war. We just basically asked questions about whether or not they wanted the U.S. to lean toward Israel, toward the Palestinians, whether or not they supported or opposed Biden's policy on Israel-Palestine broadly. So we didn't refer to the war directly in order to be able to track it over time, because we've been doing this for years so we could see the impact of the change. Nonetheless, even in that poll, keep in mind that a majority, certainly a large majority of Democrats and a majority of independents, wanted the U.S. to be even-handed. So we're talking, when I say spike, I'm talking about a spike among the minority who want the U.S. to lean toward Israel. So even in that environment, most Democrats wanted the U.S. to be even-handed on Israel-Palestine. So keep that in mind, because that's really critical for understanding what that spike means. 2 weeks later, meaning roughly a month after the war, we did another poll. And obviously by then, what we saw was all of the horror that came out of Gaza with the Israeli attacks. And here we saw a shift again. So much of the gain that Israel made in its spike 2 weeks prior disappeared. More importantly, among young Democrats, it went the other way, where young Democrats became more sympathetic with the Palestinians, even more than they were in June. Prior to the attack. So young Democrats were clearly more mobilized in favor of the Palestinians than in favor of Israel. Still, a majority wanted even-handedness. Keep that in mind as well. And what we found is that a plurality of Democrats said that Biden was too pro-Israeli. And very, very few said, like negligible number, like 2% said he's too pro-Palestinian. And when you ask them whether Biden's posture on Israel-Palestine is going to affect the vote, it was notable that a large number of young Democrats, 21%, said they're less likely to vote for him. Now, we've seen, of course, other polls, including the NBC poll that supported that and even went beyond it. Showing 70% of all young people disapproving of the president handling of this issue in a way that obviously matters for his electoral prospects. Now, does this all add up to something that Biden has to worry about? And let me just say that the bottom line is yes. Now, of course, the assumption is that because the Republicans are even more pro-Israel than Biden might be, that somehow, when you come to the elections, in the national elections, obviously Democrats are going to have a choice between what they may consider to be bad and worse. And obviously they're not going to only vote on the Israel-Palestine question. This is only one of many, and many of them may not even prioritize it high in their priorities. Here's why I think it's still going to matter. I think it's going to matter because certain constituencies have been deeply impacted in a way that they have reassessed their belief in who Joe Biden is and the character of the president. Many of them, of course, will not vote for Trump over Biden, and most of them will not vote for Trump over Biden. And I think that that's maybe why Biden seems confident. He's not going to have primaries. That this issue might be a debatable issue among Democrats, but national politics, the stakes are so high. No one wants Trump to win. And certainly no Democrat I know wants Trump to win. And that might be but that's not the way politics works. Let's start with, for example, one constituency, Arab and Muslim Americans, many of whom have said they will never vote for Biden again. Some of them will change their mind, but many will not change their mind. And remember, many Arabs and Muslims, just like some Hispanics and some African Americans, are socially conservative. And they were not so voting necessarily for the Democrats because of the social agenda, but because Trump, particularly, a lot of them were swayed to vote against Republicans because of the rise of Trump being anti-Hispanic, anti-Muslim. And that shift is what really took them there. So they may not be as uncomfortable as many other Democrats on social issues. It could impact them. And I believe it will impact them. It'll impact the way certainly Michigan will go based on that. With young Democrats, I also think this has become a litmus test for who Biden is for them, because I think the whole initial inclination to be more sympathetic with the Palestinians among Democrats has been value-based, about a notion of that embraces social justice, human rights, international law, rules-based international order, all of which they're kind of reassessing the character of the president. So yes, they will not vote for Trump for sure, but they may not be energized. They may not vote, or they may vote for a third party. So I think where I'm sitting right now, I believe that it is likely to impact the presidential prospects in 2024. And we see that also, of course, in the disapproval rating overall of the president, that is very much highly correlated with his policy on the war. And that's, if we have another month of this coming, then we're going to have more of the same effect.
Thank you very much for that, Shibli. I have a few questions for each of you before we move to the audience questions. And for those who are watching the audience, please do continue to send them in. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Aaron, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. In Israel, after October 7th, there was almost immediately conversation about how this happened, how it could have been missed, and who should be held accountable and responsible. Obviously that's not something that has taken place yet, but you've already heard some officials in Israel, not the most important one, but some of the heads of the security establishment come out and say that they do hold themselves responsible for failures and so on. I'm starting with this because ahead of the 7th, we heard from the National Security Advisor about 10 days before that in the United States, and sort of his view of the region, where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, It's more calm now in the Middle East than it's ever been. I spend less time on this issue than any national security advisor before me since 9/11 and so on and so forth. And I raise this because I think that in a lot of ways represents the administration's view towards the region before October 7th, that this issue was simply not the salient and important one that it was. It didn't have the implications for American interests and regional stability that it once did. And I'm wondering, given all of that, first, if you share that assessment, and second, if so, what should accountability look like for U.S. policymakers in a moment like this? And should there be a conversation about how this was missed and how not enough focus and energy was placed on the importance of this issue when we found ourselves in a very horrific way reminded about exactly how important it is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll address the issue of accountability. There was no accountability in the wake of Pearl Harbor. There was no accountability in the wake of 9/11. These were two events which involved direct attacks on U.S. interests, and in the case of 9/11, a direct attack on the homeland. So the issue of accountability, in a political sense, and or in a moral sense, there's no process, and there's no desire. Rarely has there been desire to draw those conclusions. On the analytical side, the question is, I think, more apt, and that is, had the Biden administration decided in January of 2021 that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was dangerously teetering, and they needed to do something to preempt what could have been a very violent confrontation. And most everyone that I know, including Palestinian pollsters, believe that if the conflict in fact came, it would come out of the West Bank, not out of Gaza. You know, in a way, Gaza has been the scene of 4 previous Israeli-Hamas confrontations, and Gaza was the birthplace of the first Intifada in December of 1987. Maybe people should have analytically grasped that. But on the broader point, and it's a thought experience, a counterfactual, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that the administration had launched, even with this Israeli government, or the last Israeli government, Lapid Bennett, a significant effort to deal with the Palestinian issue. Would that have impacted or preempted what occurred on October 7th? People have asked me that. It's a counterfactual. There's no way to know. Having dealt with the negotiations for decades, I mean, I know that the more progress they made, certainly in the 90s, this was the case, the more potential blowback from extremist elements on both sides. Rabin was murdered by an Israeli, not by an Arab. And the Hamas suicide attacks in the wake of Oslo had a significant impact on derailing those negotiations. So I don't know the answer to that question. Would Hamas have felt more compelled to stage such an attack in order to disrupt a meaningful peace process? Could there have been a meaningful peace process given the state and fate of the Palestinian Authority, and since last December, the emergence of the most extreme right-wing, even Jewish supremacist government in the history of the state of Israel? I do believe, Yusuf, however, that the administration, you read the National Security Strategy paper of 2 years ago, it's the most honest document in world history. It basically says, we've invested way too much time and effort and resources in the Middle East. We need to shift to, this is even before Russia and Ukraine, we need to shift to Europe and the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, I think there was a certain degree of complacency, glomming on to an Israeli-Saudi normalization process, however important that would have been to Israelis and Saudis. It certainly wouldn't have done much to somehow find a way to energize the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. So I think it's a mixed picture. Question now, though, is again, what are they going to do now that the Israeli-Palestinian issue, in a way, is front and center? What are they going to do now as they enter 2024, where good, sound policy, I defer to Shibli on this, will run headlong into good politics? That's the real question for this administration going forward.
Yeah.
And I want to, Shibli, I want to hear what you have to say on this, but I just want to make this note. I would add, Aaron, to your question, and it's the reason why I asked it. Are the people in the analytical views which miss the importance of this issue ahead of October 7th really in the best position to navigate U.S. policy after it? Which is why I asked the accountability question to begin with. But Shibli, I want to hear what you have to say, and then we'll.
Well, I think Aaron right, of course, about the fact that most people were anticipating, to the extent that there's going to be any kind of eruption, it's going to happen in the West Bank more than in Gaza. No question about that at all. But the reason for it is not that people thought Gaza was, not going to erupt or something of that sort, because no one anticipated Hamas had the capability to do what it did. It was really about a capability question, not about the intent question. And that, to this day, is the biggest shocker. That's why the Israelis don't want to deal with it now. They want to deal with it later. But that's the big shocker, honestly. It's not about intent whatsoever. Now, given the capability that we know now that Hamas had, would they have done it if there was something serious toward peace prior to that? Obviously, Aaron is right in the sense that we wouldn't know for sure, but I think that less likely. Let me say why. Yes, there are times when Hamas disrupted what was something moving possible because they disagreed with the agenda. But their aim is always to read public opinion, particularly Palestinian public opinion, and to know when people are despairing, when people are frustrated, when people don't have options, and try to say, we have options, but vis-a-vis the authority, vis-a-vis someone else, and in the Arab world, to capture it. I mean, that's why I think, for example, the Biden administration theory was naive. Let's tell people it's all Hamas that is causing this disaster in Gaza, and not the Israelis. It's Hamas is at fault. Palestinians and Hamas are not the same. Well, that's just not what works in times of crisis. The people did not trust the U.S. policy before. They didn't trust Biden before. They were blaming him for the stalemate. There was tremendous despair. Most of us wrote about it in April, about the despair and the coming explosion, although we obviously didn't know it was going to come from Hamas in the same way. So to that extent, if there was something that was gaining public support among Palestinians, I think they would be less likely to go against it, just because they want to. It's in their interest to gain support. And now, what could the U.S. have done before? Obviously, could there have been a serious, quote, peace process with this Israeli government and the weakened Palestinian Authority? Probably not. But there are things the U.S. could have done. I mean, one of the reasons for despair was that people have bet that Biden was going to do something more positive than Trump on this issue. And obviously he hadn't. He had taken similar positions back in the 2021 Gaza war, and instead of pushing on settlements, he was less critical of settlements than almost any American administration except for Trump. And then he defended settlements at the United Nations when it came up. And so part of the despair was that all these peaceful options were being taken off by the Biden administration. The environment was ripe for somebody to exploit it for their own purposes, for sure, but to exploit it. Now, what could be done now? One thing that we know cannot work, which is put another plan on the table. I mean, there is no trust. When you can't. I mean, there was no trust to begin with, because obviously it's been the promise of two states has been seen as a smoke screen for years now. And whether you put another plan on the table, whatever that plan is, no one is going to buy it. So whatever it is that the administration thinks it can do to save the moment, it has to be action-based, not promise-based. And what those actions might be, that's probably the path that we need to think about, very specific actions today rather than promise actions tomorrow. And that's the only way that you're going to be able to get people to trust you.
Can I just add one piece to this? Because I'm hearing from both of you the sort of engaging with this counterfactual of sort of if the U.S. was engaged in a peace process. But the reality before October 7th was not just that the United States did not invest in sort of an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, but rather that the United States was dealing with the most extremist government in Israeli history, and not just not doing something to really challenge the policies of that government, but actually providing the Israelis with a lot of gifts, including entry into the U.S. visa waiver program, pushing for this normalization agreement with the Saudis, not to mention failing to reverse some of the most significant policy decisions of the Trump administration in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So it's not just that the United States decided not to move in the direction of a peace process, but they actually really hitched themselves to this far right government. Not only did they not challenge it, but they also kind of provided them with these unprecedented gifts, which is something that is hard for me to kind of understand. And I think when I was asking about sort of foreseeing this or doing more to prevent it, it was not just about engaging in some sort of peace process, but also a real critical assessment of the months and years of engagement with the Israeli government that led up to this. I want to get Laura back in here, and Laura, feel free to comment on this. But I also had a question for you regarding Congress as well, which is perhaps a simple one, perhaps not. One of the things that we have seen reported on sort of the positions of a number of offices around this question of calling for a ceasefire or not has been that the offices of Democrat offices in particular seem to be getting far more constituent calls in support of a ceasefire than not. And many of them are still not taking that position. And obviously, we've heard some of the public opinion data as well. Why are Democrats so disconnected from their constituents on this question today, perhaps in ways that is more than before?
That's a great question. And I was listening to Shibli and Aaron. I want to actually muse a little bit on some of the stuff that was just discussed, and I can connect it. I think the bottom line is that the U.S. political system in both parties, in White House and Congress, has essentially absorbed a policy of, at best, disregard, at worst, and I think more often, a sense of outright contempt for Palestinians and for the issues related to Palestinian rights and for folks who defend those rights. I think part of that comes from the deep connection so many members have with Israel and with Israel supporters who are very active in their districts, with donors who put Israel at the center of their financial support for politics. And this is on both sides of the aisle, who have traveled over and over to Israel thanks to AIPAC and evangelical groups. Whatever it is, I think it is almost, there is a clear formula that for most members of Congress has been absorbed, which is Israel matters, Palestine doesn't. We have to deal with it sometimes, but it doesn't matter. Pro-Israel voices in our political world matter. Pro-Palestinian voices either don't matter or need to be actively attacked and delegitimized as part of our support for Israel. And that formula has largely worked, right? That's not, it's not for nothing that has been established. And I think that what you're seeing with the grassroots right now is an attempt to reset that. And whether or not members of Congress are going to be willing to reset. I mean, I'm hearing from friends who work on the Hill. Yes, we are getting more calls on this than ever before. And there's an article in Huffington Post, I think it was, saying, we're just send them to voicemail. We don't care. We don't want to hear them. I think for some members that is not going to change. They've got their formula in place and they've made a decision. Look, when you have people like Brad Sherman, a progressive on everything but Palestine, Democrat from California, who is on the record, his tweet is still up, calling young Jewish activists who are at the DNC calling for protest, for ceasefire, engaged in civil disobedience, and he calls them violent pro-terrorist protesters. I mean, that's how he's referring to the sons and daughters and grandchildren of his Jewish supporters, and he's fine with it. He hasn't taken it down. But that sense of just absolute disinterest in or contempt for Palestinian lives and people who support Palestinians is right now part of the weave. It's woven into U.S. politics, and I don't know if we're going to see this crisis start to change that. I suspect it will at some level. I don't know how deep it will go. When we're talking about, and this goes directly to this question of contempt and disregard, what can happen now, and both Shibley and Aaron talked about what the administration could do or might do. I actually think this question of contempt and disregard is at the center of it. And I've heard friends in the administration talking about, ideas for, grand meetings and getting the Arabs involved and the Gulf states can lead and building reconstruction and, getting back to the two-state solution. I get it. I'm a former, I was in the State Department. I understand it looks that's how you think. I don't think any of that actually addresses the real immediate question here is this administration capable of engaging in a public and serious and meaningful way, not just empty rhetoric, but they're not even doing rhetoric now, which conveys to Americans, and these are Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans in general, Muslim Americans, brown and black Americans, younger progressive Americans, who are outraged right now at what feels like an absolute betrayal of their values as progressives. Are they able to convey in a meaningful way actual empathy for Palestinians, an actual sense of a duty of care in U.S. policy for Palestinian lives? And I don't see that yet. Are they able to convey a sense of respect for and duty of care for the protesters from their own grassroots? Again, so far we're not seeing that. Are they willing to take any real stand on Islamophobia, on attacks on Palestinians? We have, multiple statements from Democrats in Congress and in the White House and in State Department, everywhere else about anti-Semitism. We have hearings on the Hill. Since October 7th, we've had a baby stabbed to death, or a young child stabbed to death in his house. And we just had 3 Palestinian Americans shot, basically for walking wall Palestinian in Vermont. The administration isn't putting the safety and the fundamental rights to protest, to free speech, to exist of Palestinians and of people who support Palestinians in our own country. They're not making that a priority, let alone the lives of people far away who are being killed and threatened and injured by our ally Israel. I don't know what they can do to change that, but talking about peace plans and day after strategies will do zero, in my opinion, to affect where the grassroots is and to affect the challenges they're facing in the next election.
Thank you for that, Laura. And I wanted to thank Aaron, who I know has to drop off a little bit early now. But we appreciate you joining us, and we'll definitely continue with this conversation now. Laura, I wanted to ask you.
Could just add one thing. I really
absolutely. Go ahead.
The opportunity to participate. I think this, and Laura and Shibley, I think are really phenomenal. We really need to continue this, and I certainly would like to be a part of it. But congrats! I thought it was a great discussion, and thanks for including me.
Appreciate you being here. Thank you, Aaron. Laura, I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned in your comments. I noticed it as well for a while now, and you talked about sort of this somewhat unprecedented, political football with aid to Israel, with the Republicans trying to attach it to IRS policy, and I also noted that when the president made his sort of major speech announcing this, he tied it to funding to Ukraine. And Israel has sort of at a time of really unprecedented partisanship in American politics has become sort of a unique tool to get certain things unstuck in Congress. just before October 7th, Congress was mired in a unprecedented situation where they couldn't elect a Speaker of the House for a really long time. And it was really not until it became apparent that nothing, including this aid for Israel, could happen in Congress, that finally, things started moving on that front as well. And so we're seeing, Israel as this odd tool to kind of get things unstuck, and both parties using it to try to advance other things that they can't move otherwise in Congress. What does this say about how deep support for Israel really is in U.S. politics?
That's a great question. I'll make just two quick observations. First, on foreign aid, I think it's, for those of us who've done this for years, I mean, I remember this is more than a decade ago, the first time I heard someone refer to AIPAC's argument when people would say that Israel gets too much foreign aid, and AIPAC would say two things. They'd say it's not that Israel gets too much of the US foreign aid, it's that the foreign aid pie is too small. So they were in favor of increasing all foreign aid as a way of defending the very large part that Israel gets. But the other argument they made is that aid to Israel is the engine that pulls all other foreign aid behind it, because foreign aid is not popular in Congress. It's not popular with the American people, but aid for Israel is. So that's how you get the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill passed every year, is that the Israel money is in it, and it pulls everything else with it. And that was their argument going back decades. As far as where things are today, look, I also want to remind people, I mentioned the Iron Dome battle before. The fact is that Israel aid is supposed to be sacrosanct. It is bipartisan. You can't put conditions on it. Only outright anti-Semites would ever call for putting conditions on aid for Israel. That is the framing, right? It's never been conditioned in any way, which is true by and large. Loan guarantees issue aside, which we can get into, but we don't need to. But the fact is, right now, I would say that if Republicans had come to the Biden administration or in Congress and said, listen, we're not going to pass your Israel money with Ukraine, give us a clean Israel spending bill, nothing but the aid for Israel, I think they would have been probably in a good position to force Democrats into a corner, because then it would have been Democrats saying, no, the condition on passing this is Ukraine aid. That didn't happen because they wanted to put their own conditions. And I want to really emphasize the condition about offsetting the dollar for dollar spending is unprecedented. There's something, emergency aid, whatever the context is not part of the regular budget. The idea that Republicans are now arguing that when there is a natural catastrophe or an act of war and the administration wants to fund something, it has to be cut from the funding, which is already cut to the bone of a core U.S. agency, it's just remarkable. But what's even more remarkable is it doesn't seem controversial, in the same way that, again, going back to the Iron Dome money funding, when that was held up for like 36 hours in the House, that was considered hugely controversial. But then it sat in the Senate for weeks because Rand Paul held it up. So when you had Democrats briefly holding it up, wanting to go through regular order, that showed that Democrats are anti-Israel. Rand Paul holding it up in the Senate for weeks and weeks, that wasn't even news anymore. So on the one hand, I think the aid for Israel is absolutely bipartisan and has been. The depth of support for it, I think, is more of a political football. I think at the end of the day, everyone is going to, except for a tiny number of people, are going to say, yes, we absolutely support this and we'll vote for it. In terms of how we get to that vote, that is very political. And frankly, Republicans and Republican supporters play much harder ball than Democrats on this.
Thank you, Laura. Shibli, I had some questions for you about public opinion, but I also wanted to ask you something about a point that you raised in response to some of Aaron's comments earlier, particularly as it relates to the U.S. decision to send aircraft carriers to the region, and how that could have easily been escalatory as much as it was an act of deterrence. From what we can sort of glean from the statements of U.S. officials, including the president himself, is the idea is that if Hezbollah was to sort of get involved in a major way, that the U.S. would get involved in Lebanon. And at least this is the sort of understanding that we get from the messages, right, that they've been sending. The Israelis have said in talking about what they would do in Lebanon, and if there was a major second front opened, that it would, Beirut would look like Gaza. I mean, they're basically they're telegraphing that they would be doing in Lebanon the kind of a mass targeting of civilian infrastructure that they've done in Gaza, and the kind of targeting that this administration has started to suggest that they have some unease for. How does that complicate the credibility of deterrence with these aircraft carriers being in the region, and this commitment on the part of the United States to get itself involved in Lebanon should a major second front open up?
First, let's think about the imagery, right? So, I mean, part of the problem, the U.S. has always been pro-Israel. That has not, the U.S. has never really been an even-handed broker anytime, right? This is not surprising in a way, the U.S., but the U.S. has at least taken a posture to distance itself a little bit so it can be in a position to impact events directly, indirectly. In this particular case, it seems as if the U.S., it seems to much of the region, as if the U.S. is enabling this entire operation. And, from the president's, statement basically not being critical of anything, we support the Israeli aims, it's self-defense, and then going to Israel and attending a meeting of the War Cabinet, sending American forces to the region, now obviously making available possibly stockpiles the U.S. military to go. So the imagery is this is America's war, and that obviously is problematic for everything in terms of how people are receiving it. Does it have a deterrence part? Yes, of course it does. I mean, in some ways, I understand the deterrence part of it, meaning that on the one hand, what you're going to see is that if you're in Iran or Hezbollah, I don't think they would have wanted an escalation if they can avoid it, right? I don't think this is a good time for Iran or Hezbollah to go into an all-out war with Israel, regardless of what the U.S. does. But sure, if the U.S. if they think the U.S. is going to enter, that complicates the calculus for them in terms of what it might be. But it can also be escalatory for two reasons, not just one. One reason is obviously the unexpected things that happen when you have military out there, and you're going to have some blowback from some groups that might target you. We've already seen that, of course, in Iraq and Syria. You're going to have probing the limits. There could be miscalculation, as we've seen with the drones approaching aircraft carrier. So there is obviously the unexpected escalation anytime you put forces on the ground. But there is also another element that cannot be ignored. We know that the Prime Minister of Israel and many ministers in his government, but the Prime Minister himself in the past had wanted to draw the U.S. into war with Iran. And we know that it happened under Obama. One reason why Obama focused on the Iran nuclear deal in the second term was to avoid being drawn into a war with Iran. We know that in the last few months of the Trump administration, there was an attempt to draw the U.S. into war with Iran, that the generals resisted, but also Trump's aversion for big wars may have helped him there to avert that. And so when you are saying there are no red lines, can you trust even that there will be no moves coming out of the Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli government, that might lead to escalation? Obviously, the Biden administration, there's evidence, is truly worrying about that prospect right now. And they're actually sending signals to the Israelis not to escalate further in the north. So I think, yes, it has there. I do not rule out escalation at this point. Obviously, it could have happened before. There were efforts to prevent it, but as I said earlier, the war ain't over, and we really don't know how this is all going to come out. And anybody who thinks they do has not followed this issue closely enough. So I'm worried. I'm very worried that we could still be drawn into an escalation that would be devastating for American interests, but devastating for the regions as well. for the
You know, one
region.
thing, I mean, I agree with that. I think one of the things that has really shocked me in terms of the U.S. Approach in response to this crisis so far is the extent to which the Biden administration seems willing to put so many American interests at risk and hinging on the decision making of one person, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who not only has, you know, the history that you point out of wanting to draw the United States into confrontation with Iran, but you know, is surrounded by some pretty extremist people in his cabinet, has not really been interested in peace with the Palestinians, and also is, you know, likely to see the end of his political career in a major investigation into his conduct at the end of this war, whenever it happens. And under such conditions, it's just hard to wrap your head around the extent of trust that the president seems to have in Netanyahu in such a critical moment. I also wanted to ask you, Shibli, about something that we didn't get a chance to touch on very much. And Aaron didn't touch on it very much either, but that's the role of sort of global public opinion. You started to get into regional public opinion and the way that this is perceived. But one of the dimensions of this for U.S. foreign policy is also how this impacts other issues. The way that U.S. credibility is seen not just in the region but around the world. And what that means for other U.S. foreign policy priorities. I mean, one of the reasons why the United States was not as focused on this issue was because it was very much focused on another issue, which was the war in Ukraine, which it sort of had messaged to the world was really all about upholding this rules-based order and you know, pushing back against Russian aggression and occupation and what have you. And for people all around the world who are watching the U.S. response here, one set of policies certainly militates against the other. So how do we assess that?
Well, it's a good question, because I think you're absolutely right that this has not just been something about Arab and Muslim countries and publics. This has been global. I think there's no question that it has undermined American credibility globally and its ability to push its agenda. Including, by the way, getting support for the war in Ukraine, obviously, which was an important part of the president's agenda, one that I have supported, and I think it was the right thing to support Ukraine against the Russian invasion. But I think it's from the beginning, the administration had a tough time selling that to the global South. They sold it well in Europe, obviously. Revival of NATO came out of it, but they've had a tough time selling it to the global South. And this is making it much harder, because you could see the global South reaction, including Latin American countries that have been extremely opposed to the Israeli military, some of them anyway. But you see the demonstrations even in the West and elsewhere around the globe against the war. It's galvanized public opinion in a way that we have not seen since the Iraq War in 2003. Yeah, this is really kind of a serious global moment that has been sustained. The problem for the president, too, is that he is, in a way, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine, but even before, kind of framed American policy in terms of defending a rules-based international order, and even defending a liberal rules-based international order, which of course has human rights built into it. And certainly it was very hard for anyone in the world, honestly, including for many Americans, to reconcile that with his posture on Gaza. And I think that is obviously something that is going to undermine his credibility moving forward. And it has obviously played into the hands of players like China and Russia in the global game. So they're going to have to rethink even the posture that they want to take moving forward. I'm not even sure. I want to keep saying after the war is over. I'm not even sure what that means. I'm not sure this war, quote, will be over. I don't really understand what an ending is here. But if there's a moment, at least for active diplomacy globally, what that might look like in a way that could revive, semblance of credibility for the U.S. in the global context.
Thank you, Shibli. I want to move to some of the questions that we have from our audience, and I know several have been sent in. Laura, I want to start directing a couple of these to you. First is a technical one. I think you mentioned one of the bills that is, being introduced around sort of deporting Palestinians or some such. There's a question of how does that operate? How are Palestinians identified in that to sort of deny them visas or to deport them or and so on? Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. The bottom line is it doesn't work. I mean, this is just straight up open. This isn't these are grandstanding pieces of legislation that are racist. I mean, you could, if you're trying to operationalize this, and you could look for people who are on Palestinian travel documents, so they say passes, the Palestinian Authority travel documents. I mean, there are Palestinians who are on Israeli passports. There are Palestinians who are on passports from around the world. This legislation is meant to signal. And, in a Trump administration, it took form of things like Muslim bans, where you can have broader bans and you can ban certain passports. I think it's really, they are signaling an intent that is along those lines. I don't think there's a lot of detail has been put into how this would be actually implementable or implemented. And the idea of going after people who are already in this country, the framing there is both in terms of going after people who are Palestinian or Palestinian descent on visas, but more than that, it's about framing the argument that they have violated their visas because they're, as being Palestinians or people who've engaged in any kind of protest, they are now showing themselves to be supporters of terrorism. A lot of this is about sort of twinning racism against Palestinians with trying to reinterpret U.S. anti-terror laws to suggest that any support for the Palestinian cause or Palestinian rights or ceasefire is support for Hamas, which is an FTO, it's a designated foreign terrorist organization, and therefore trying to make an argument that anyone who does that on a foreign visa, particularly Arabs or Palestinians, are violating U.S. law and should be deported or prevented entry. And I will say that piece of it is the one that really does worry me the most, and that's getting support from groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which have asked the Department of Justice to press U.S. universities, or they're pressing U.S. universities to essentially investigate student groups that are supportive of Palestinians based on the argument that coming out in the streets supportive of Palestinian rights and Palestinian lives, or saying things like there was history before October 7th, which is seen as apologizing for or justifying Hamas attacks, that all of that means that they are violating U.S. anti-terror law, which involves a complete re-understanding of U.S. anti-terror law to reimagine material support to mean a presumed sympathy. That becomes illegal. At that point, we're in a whole new era of McCarthyism.
Thanks for that, Laura. I want to sort of piggyback on that with this other question, and it touches on public opinion as well. So Shibli, if you want to get in on this too, one of the questions is sort of to what extent does the increase in what the question refers to as pro-Palestinian sympathies among young Americans have to do with the activities of student groups that Laura, you talk about being targeted now. Do you want to take a first crack at that?
I don't think it's necessarily student groups at all, honestly. I think student groups obviously matter for students. But I think, we know exactly what happened among the young people and why they have become more sympathetic with the Palestinians. There are basically four reasons over time. One is demographic, because particularly the young Democrats become less male and less white, and much more diverse, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, women. And those have typically been the constituencies that have had more sympathy and openness to the Palestinians over the years. And so that is a group of young people that is energized. Number two, social media. It's not a student group, it's social media. It's the sources of information. I mean, we've tested this. Is not something, if you're watching cable news network. It doesn't matter from anywhere from Fox News to CNN to MSNBC. You're getting a certain picture. If you're reading the New York Times and the Washington Post, you're basing your opinion on mainstream establishment media. You have different views from people who are getting their information mostly, or in some cases entirely, from a much more diverse sources in the social media and internet. We know that's where most young people go. They don't go to establishment. Many of them never watch TV in the way we think of watching TV, unless it's a clip put on a social media site that is being repeated. So we know that is that is definitely the case. Number three, we have seen that over the past decade and a half, the Israeli government has been a right-wing government, even before the rise of this far right, mostly right-wing government, and mostly led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been seen in the American political context as not only right-wing, but also an ally of Republicans and ally of the Republican Party and ally of Donald Trump that they disliked. So there's this kind of linking between the Israel they know and where it stands across the board. And finally, I think particularly during the Trump era, where the divide was less party-based as much as it is value-based, where you have a kind of a cultural war, and there was also the era not just of on the one hand you had somebody who was attacking Muslims, attacking Hispanics, attacking African Americans, but you also had a focus on social justice and Black Lives Matter and so forth. And so the galvanized kind of value system of younger people has been mostly around these broad issues. And the Israel-Palestine issue emerged as part of that, maybe even a litmus test for that grouping, in a way that we hadn't seen. So it was seen when people looked at Israel-Palestine, particularly young people, they were not looking at it through a strategic prism of America's national interest, as typically is the case, or like many of the evangelicals look at it, which is through the prism of biblical prophecy, but rather through the prism of social justice. And we've seen that even not just among young Democrats, that is there for sure, but as I have written in the past based on polling that I've done and other scholars like in North Carolina have done, that even young evangelicals have become a little bit more drawn to the social justice issue during the Trump era, and they have started wanting a much more balanced policy toward Israel-Palestine.
And yet, Laura, some of the policy responses that we see to these shifts look like policing and repression, not just of student groups, but increasingly now we're hearing talk about regulation of social media, of places like TikTok, which is particularly popular among the youngest generation, of being the problem itself, and so on. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with Shibley. I think that, what we're seeing here is a generation that has been shaped by the legacy of the wars of their parents, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, Guantanamo Bay. It's a generation or generations now that frame their values in terms of people and planet, not tribe and nationality. Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. I mean, this is a generation that, I'm increasingly arguing that the way people need to understand the politics around Israel-Palestine, how Israel-Palestine is playing with students on campus, with student groups, with activists on the ground. This is, I would argue, the Vietnamization of the issue. It has become a generational gap. It has become a gap between the people and the government, and it is fundamentally about values and is shaped by people who are not allowing their news to be essentially filtered by talking heads who say, this is what you're allowed to think, this is what you're allowed to see. They're saying, I don't need you. I can get online and watch the videos directly from Gaza. And there's no amount of PR, either US or Israeli Hasbara, that's going to explain why it's okay that I'm looking at a pancaked building with children's legs sticking out from under it. There's nothing you're going to say that's going to fix that. And the focus on, on trying to shut down student groups and trying to now shut down professors and social media, it fundamentally goes back to something, Yusuf, you and I have talked about for a long time around like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. These are the baseline arguments around Israel are not going to be won by the Israeli government or by pro-Israel forces on the US by the facts. They cannot win these arguments. Again, there's no amount of Hasbara or statements from the White House or from the ADL that are going to make people okay with the visuals they're seeing out of Gaza. And saying it's Hamas's fault that we were forced to kill your children doesn't work. Just like it didn't work when people started seeing the images out of Cambodia. If you watch some of the debate online about the death of Kissinger, people remember that, and people who are alive then remember that. And if you can't win the argument on facts, the go-to approach is we will shut down those facts. We will shut down access to those facts. We will delegitimize the sources of those facts, and we'll attack people who insist on talking about them. And that's really where we've been for a while. It predates October 7th. The energies are there. The infrastructure has been laid for the outright assault that we're seeing on free speech today. The question is whether or not, we've been able to withstand it by and large for the past decade as it's been mounting. Can it be withstood today? I don't know. The one thing that actually gives me some hope, and I, in a sense, have more hope that we can withstand this assault today than I did before October 7th, is that, when I think back to what I know about the era of McCarthyism that I read about, when I was in school and was taught about by my grandparents, McCarthyism worked because people were so afraid that they let it work. They allowed it to be used against their friends and colleagues. They were so scared of what it might happen to them that they allowed people to be taken down by thought police. And what it looks to me right now in the US is that's not happening. And it's not, I think, going to happen easily. And if everyone stands up and says, I care about Palestinian rights, when people come for those who do care about Palestinian rights, if everyone else stands up and say, no, I care about these rights, I care about free speech, I'm not going to sit by, I think it's a lot harder to win, for them to win.
Thank you for that, Laura. And I think that's a good note for us to wrap on. And we'll remind folks again to look out for our upcoming event on intensifying repression on this very topic, on the 12th of December. And I want to thank all of our panelists, Laura Shibley and Aaron, who had to drop off a little bit earlier, for joining us today. And engaging with our audience. Thank you to you all who tuned in, and for our panelists again for being generous with their time and insights. And sorry for not being able to get to all of the questions, but we will definitely continue to be talking about this issue for some time to come. Please continue to follow the center's work at arabcenterdc.org. And for those of you who have asked, you will be able to find a recording of the webinar if you want to watch it again or share it with friends at the website. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.